They laughed at the number on the scale. One man noticed the weight she carried that no scale could ever measure. I used to believe people looked into your eyes when they talked to you. By 27, I had learned they usually looked somewhere else first. Sometimes it was the extra space I occupied walking between tables. Sometimes it was the way my black waitress uniform stretched across my shoulders. Sometimes it was the dessert menu in my hands, as if it somehow belonged to me instead of the customers I served. Every glance lasted only a second, but after years of collecting those seconds, they felt heavy enough to fill an entire lifetime. Friday nights at Bellissimo were always the busiest. The little Italian restaurant sat on a quiet corner of Manhattan, where polished black sedans lined the curb and people wore watches worth more than my car. I balanced a tray loaded with sparkling water glasses while weaving between candlelit tables, smiling the same practiced smile I had perfected over 6 years. It wasn't fake. It simply belonged to work. The real Emily Carter stayed hidden somewhere beneath comfortable shoes, aching feet, and polite apologies. "Excuse me. Right away. Thank you for your patience." Those words came easier than introducing myself anymore. Most customers never remembered my name anyway. They remembered the plus-size waitress. They remembered the girl who breathed a little harder after climbing the stairs. They remembered everything except the person standing in front of them. "Honey," one woman whispered just loudly enough for everyone at her table to hear. "Maybe skip bringing yourself any bread tonight." Laughter floated across the table like champagne bubbles. Light, effortless, practiced. I smiled anyway. Would anyone like fresh Parmesan? My voice stayed calm, even though my fingers tightened around the serving spoon. You learn strange survival skills when embarrassment becomes part of your paycheck. Never argue. Never cry at the table. Never let strangers decide whether you deserve kindness. The restaurant buzzed with conversation, clinking glasses, and soft jazz drifting through hidden speakers. Garlic, fresh basil, warm bread, and roasted tomatoes filled the air. Usually those smells comforted me. Tonight they only reminded me I still had 4 more hours before my shift ended. My phone vibrated once inside my apron pocket. I didn't have to check it. Every Friday at exactly 7:15, Mom texted me to remind me not to skip dinner. She had no idea I usually packed whatever leftovers the kitchen couldn't sell. She worried enough already. I wouldn't let her know I was working double shifts again to help cover another round of medical bills. Emily, Marco, the floor manager, nodded toward the private dining section. VIP table just arrived. I glanced toward the back of the restaurant. 5 men in tailored dark suits stepped inside without saying much. They didn't need to. Conversations around them softened on their own. The man walking in the center moved with quiet confidence instead of arrogance, his charcoal suit fitting perfectly, his dark hair brushed neatly back, his calm blue eyes scanning the room without lingering on anyone. Adrian Moretti looked like someone completely comfortable carrying responsibility that would crush most people. Expensive watch, Italian leather shoes, calm expression, nothing flashy, nothing desperate to impress. Yet every employee instinctively stood a little straighter as he approached his reserved table near the windows. I picked up their menus, smoothed my apron, and walked toward them. Before I could say a single word, another burst of laughter echoed behind me. Someone muttered, "She probably eats the leftovers before customers can order them." The words landed exactly where they were meant to. I kept walking, but for the first time all evening, I noticed something unexpected. Adrian Moretti wasn't looking at my body. He was watching my face. I expected Adrian Moretti to ignore me the same way every wealthy customer eventually did. Rich people had perfected the art of seeing only the service, never the person carrying it. I approached his table with 5 leather-bound menus balanced against my arm and my usual smile firmly in place. "Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Bellissimo. My name is Emily, and I will be taking care of you tonight." My voice sounded steady, even if my confidence had been chipped away one careless comment at a time. Adrian looked up from the crystal water glass in front of him. His blue eyes met mine without rushing away, without scanning my body, without carrying that familiar flicker of judgment I had learned to recognize from across a crowded room. It lasted only a heartbeat, but it felt strangely unfamiliar. "Good evening, Emily," he replied quietly. He said my name as though it actually belonged to me. The 4 men seated beside him continued discussing business in low voices while I explained the evening specials. Imported sea bass, handmade lobster ravioli, dry-aged ribeye, Expensive dishes ordered by people who rarely looked at prices. Adrian listened politely, thanked me, and handed the menus to his associates before saying, "Take your time. Nobody needs to rush." His calm voice somehow slowed the entire table. I excused myself and moved toward another section where a birthday party had just arrived. Balloons floated above one table. Children laughed near the front windows, and somewhere in the kitchen Marco shouted another order. The restaurant settled back into its familiar rhythm until I heard someone snap their fingers behind me. Mississippi. I turned toward table 12. A sharply dressed man wearing an expensive navy blazer leaned back in his chair with an amused smile. His companions already looked entertained before he even spoke. "Could we get another basket of bread?" he asked. "Of course." I smiled. "Anything else?" He looked directly at me before saying, "Actually, maybe keep one basket for yourself. Looks like you skipped that part of your diet plan." The table erupted into laughter. Even the woman beside him covered her mouth, while trying unsuccessfully to hide her grin. My cheeks warmed instantly. I had heard hundreds of jokes before. Different words. Same message. Somehow they always found a new way to repeat an old wound. I forced myself to nod politely. "I will bring your bread right away, sir." As I turned toward the kitchen, I noticed several nearby diners pretending not to hear. People always became very interested in their wine glasses. Whenever someone else was embarrassed, that was easier than choosing kindness. Inside the kitchen, I inhaled deeply before placing fresh bread into a warm basket. Maria, another server, glanced at my face. "You okay?" she whispered. I answered automatically. "I am fine." She knew I was lying. We both knew there was nothing either of us could do about customers who believed money purchased the right to humiliate strangers. I carried the bread back into the dining room with the same careful posture I had practiced for years. Do not spill anything. Do not let your hands shake. Do not give them another reason to laugh. As I passed the private dining section, I caught something unusual from the corner of my eye. Adrian Moretti was no longer speaking with his associates. His untouched espresso sat cooling beside his plate while his gaze followed me across the room. There was no amusement in his expression, no pity either, only quiet attention, as though he had witnessed something everyone else had decided was too ordinary to notice. The evening should have settled back into its comfortable rhythm after that. Plates moved from kitchen to table. Wine glasses caught the warm glow of hanging lights. Soft jazz floated through the dining room, while conversations blended into a gentle hum. I wanted nothing more than to disappear into that familiar routine. Busy meant invisible, and invisible usually meant safe. I collected empty appetizer plates from a family celebrating a birthday near the front windows when I noticed a little boy wandering away from his table. He could not have been older than 6. His untied sneaker dragged slightly against the hardwood floor as he proudly carried a breadstick almost as long as his forearm. His parents were laughing with relatives, distracted by presents, candles, and photographs. The boy smiled to himself as he took another oversized bite while walking. Something about the way he suddenly stopped made every instinct inside me tighten. He froze beside the dessert display. The breadstick slipped from his hand. His small eyes widened with confusion instead of fear, and both hands reached toward his throat. At first, nobody noticed. A nearby couple continued discussing vacation plans. Silverware clinked against porcelain. Someone laughed at another joke across the room. The little boy tried to cough, but no sound came out. My tray hit the nearest service station before I even realized I had set it down. Years ago, my mother had insisted I complete a basic first aid course with her community volunteer group. At the time, I had complained about giving up an entire Saturday. Now those forgotten lessons came rushing back with startling clarity. I hurried toward the child, keeping my voice calm. "It is okay, sweetheart. I am here." His frightened eyes found mine. Tears gathered instantly. His mother finally looked over. The smile disappeared from her face so quickly it was almost painful to watch. "Ethan," she cried, rushing forward. Panic spread faster than fire. Chairs scraped across the floor. Conversation stopped. Someone shouted for a doctor. Another person reached for a phone. The room that had ignored me all evening suddenly felt completely still. I gently knelt beside the boy. "Ma'am," I said carefully, looking at his mother, "please give us just a little space." She nodded through trembling breaths, trusting a stranger because she had no other choice. I focused entirely on the child. One careful movement, Then another. My own heartbeat pounded so loudly I could barely hear the music anymore. Come on, sweetheart. Breathe. The next second felt endless. Then the blockage cleared. The little boy coughed hard before taking one deep, shaky breath followed by another. The sound was the most beautiful thing I had heard in years. His mother dropped to her knees beside him, wrapping him in the gentlest embrace while tears streamed freely down her face. Around us, the restaurant exhaled all at once. Applause rose from every corner of the dining room, quiet at first, then growing louder until it filled the entire space. I stepped back instinctively, my cheeks warming for a completely different reason this time. I had not done anything extraordinary. I had simply done what anyone should do when another human being needed help. The little boy looked up at me and whispered, "Thank you." His tiny voice nearly broke my heart. As his family surrounded him, I quietly picked up the abandoned tray and brushed invisible crumbs from my apron, hoping everything could return to normal. But when I lifted my head, I realized Adrian Moretti was already standing. His untouched dinner remained on the table behind him, and for the first time that evening, every person in the restaurant seemed to be watching exactly what he was watching. The applause lingered for only a few seconds before life slowly reclaimed the restaurant. Parents hugged their son again and again, grateful tears replacing panic. Diners returned to their conversations, although their voices remained softer now, touched by the fragile reminder that an ordinary evening could change in a single heartbeat. I picked up my tray, straightened my apron, and reminded myself there were still tables waiting for refills, checks, and dessert menus. That was the strange thing about restaurant work. No matter what happened, dinner service never stopped. "Emily." I turned toward the little boy's mother. She held Ethan's hand tightly, while wiping tears from her cheeks with her free hand. "I do not even know how to thank you." I smiled gently. Seeing him smile again is enough. Ethan stepped closer and wrapped both arms around my waist before I could react. "You saved me," he whispered. My throat tightened. "You were very brave," I answered softly. "Do not forget that." His father reached into his wallet, pulling out several $100 bills. "Please, let us do something." I shook my head immediately. "I cannot accept that, sir." "Then at least let us speak to your manager. People should know what you did." Before I could answer, Marco hurried over with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Usually he spoke in rushed instructions and reminders about table numbers. Tonight he looked almost speechless. "Emily," he said quietly, "the family would like to cover everyone's dessert tonight in your honor." I blinked in surprise. "That is very generous." The dining room responded with another wave of applause, gentler this time, filled with warmth instead of excitement. Heat rushed into my face. I wanted nothing more than to disappear back into the kitchen. I had never been comfortable standing in the center of attention. "Everyone," Marco announced, raising his voice just enough to carry across the room. "Let us hear it one more time for Emily." More applause echoed through Bellissimo. I lowered my eyes, embarrassed, and thanked them with a small nod before quietly returning to work. That was when I passed the table where the earlier jokes had started. The man in the navy blazer suddenly found his steak much more interesting than looking at me. None of his friends laughed now. Their smiles had disappeared somewhere between Ethan's frightened silence and his joyful laugh moments later. They avoided my eyes completely. It should have felt satisfying. Instead, it simply felt sad. How quickly people changed when kindness became fashionable. As I collected empty glasses nearby, I noticed Adrian Moretti standing beside the window with one hand resting lightly against the back of his chair. He had not joined the applause immediately. He had watched everything with the same quiet focus that had unsettled me since he walked through the front door. One of the men seated with him leaned closer and said something too softly for me to hear. Adrian answered with only a slight shake of his head before his eyes found me again. There was no admiration exaggerated for appearance, no exaggerated praise meant to impress. His expression carried something calmer. Respect. Genuine, uncomplicated respect. For reasons I could not explain, that simple realization unsettled me more than every compliment I had received all night. I looked away first and continued delivering dinners as though nothing had happened. Yet every few minutes I caught myself wondering why a man who seemed to command every room he entered had spent the evening paying attention to someone the rest of the world had spent years overlooking. The dinner rush finally settled into a slower rhythm, but my mind refused to follow. I kept replaying Ethan's relieved smile every time I carried another plate from the kitchen. Moments like that reminded me why kindness always mattered, even when nobody seemed to notice. The stack of unpaid medical bills waiting on my apartment counter, however, cared very little about moments. Neither did the rent due next Tuesday. I refilled coffee cups, cleared dessert plates, and thanked every customer with the same quiet smile. It was easier to keep moving than to think. Around 9 o'clock, Maria slipped beside me while polishing wine glasses. "You are all anyone is talking about tonight," she whispered with a grin. I laughed softly. "Give them 20 minutes. Somebody else will become more interesting." She shook her head. "Not him." Without saying another word, she nodded toward the private dining section. Adrian Moretti remained seated, yet his attention seemed divided between his business conversation and the dining room itself. I quickly looked away before anyone noticed. "Stop that," Maria teased. "Stop what?" "Pretending you do not know he has watched you all night." I felt my face warm again. "He is probably just waiting for his check." "Emily, men like that do not spend 3 hours staring at waitresses because they are excited about tiramisu." I smiled despite myself. "You watch too many movies." She laughed and returned to the kitchen before I could answer again. I picked up another tray and headed toward table 7, where an elderly couple waited for fresh coffee. They came in every Friday, always ordering one dessert to share. Mr. Reynolds smiled as I topped off his cup. "My wife says you reminded her of our daughter tonight." I blinked. "Really?" Mrs. Reynolds reached across the table and gently touched my hand. "You helped that little boy before anyone else even understood what was happening." Her eyes glistened with quiet emotion. "The world needs more people who react that way." My throat tightened. "Thank you. Your mother must be very proud." I swallowed carefully before answering. "She would probably tell you I forget to take care of myself while taking care of everyone else." They laughed warmly. It sounded different from the laughter earlier that evening. This laughter lifted something instead of weighing it down. After leaving their table, I passed the hostess stand where 2 delivery boxes rested beside the counter. I recognized the pharmacy logo immediately. My stomach sank. I had planned to pick up Mom's heart medication after work. The reminder on my phone flashed silently across the screen. Due tomorrow. Somehow I would make it work. I always did. Nobody at Bellissimo knew I worked breakfast shifts at a neighborhood bakery 3 mornings every week before coming here in the evenings. Nobody knew I had quietly sold my vacation days 2 years in a row because medical insurance never covered everything. Complaining had never paid a bill. So I simply kept going. Across the restaurant, Adrian accepted a folder from one of his associates. He barely glanced at the documents before closing it again. His calm expression never changed, but I noticed his eyes drift toward me once more as I tucked my phone back into my apron. It was only a second, long enough to notice the pharmacy notification reflected across the dark screen before it disappeared into the pocket. He said nothing. He asked nothing. Yet something about the way his expression softened made me wonder whether he had just seen another piece of the life I worked so hard to keep invisible. Closing time was still more than an hour away when the front doors opened again. A burst of cool Manhattan air swept across the dining room, carrying the faint scent of rain from the streets outside. I looked up automatically, expecting another late reservation. Instead, I recognized the man in the navy blazer from earlier. This time he was not smiling. 3 colleagues followed him back inside. Their loud conversation cutting through the softer atmosphere Bellissimo had finally regained. Marco hurried over with the professional smile every restaurant manager mastered after years of impossible customers. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome back." "We forgot something," the man replied casually, although his eyes were already searching the room until they landed on me. My stomach tightened before he spoke another word. Experience had taught me that some people hated being reminded of their own behavior. They would rather embarrass someone twice than admit they had been wrong once. Marco glanced toward me. "Emily, would you mind helping them?" I nodded. Before I could think twice. Of course. I walked over carrying the same calm expression that had carried me through hundreds of uncomfortable conversations. "Good evening again. How may I help you?" The man leaned back with folded arms. "Actually, I wanted to apologize." His tone sounded polite enough that I almost believed him. Earlier, I made an insensitive joke. I smiled gently. "Thank you. I appreciate that." For one hopeful second, I thought the evening might end peacefully. Then he laughed. "Although judging by tonight, Maybe all that extra strength finally came in handy. His friends chuckled immediately. One added, I guess heroes come in every size now. Another muttered something about restaurant portions before shaking his head with an amused grin. The laughter spread across their table again. Not as loud as before. Somehow meaner. Deliberate. They wanted me to hear every word. I felt my heartbeat quicken, but I refused to let it reach my face. Would you like coffee before you leave? I asked quietly. No, the first man answered. Just thought we would congratulate Bellissimo on hiring someone unforgettable. My fingers tightened around my order pad beneath the table where nobody could see. I reminded myself to breathe. Do not argue. Do not cry. Do not give strangers permission to define who you are. Those rules had protected me for years. Around us, conversations slowed again. People were listening without pretending not to this time. Ethan's family remained seated across the room. Maria stood frozen beside the espresso machine. Even Marco looked uncertain, caught between defending an employee and avoiding another public confrontation. I lowered my eyes for a brief moment, searching for the strength to simply walk away. Then an unfamiliar silence settled over the restaurant. It spread so naturally that every conversation faded without anyone asking. I looked toward the private dining section. Adrian Moretti had risen from his chair. He buttoned his charcoal suit jacket with one slow, deliberate movement before walking across the dining room. His footsteps were unhurried, almost quiet, yet every pair of eyes followed him. Nobody interrupted. Nobody questioned why he was approaching. He stopped beside my table instead of in front of the men who had been mocking me. His attention remained on me first. Emily, he said calmly, are you all right? The simple question caught me completely off guard. Not because of the words themselves, but because he asked them as though the answer truly mattered. I nodded softly. Yes, thank you. Only then did Adrian turn toward the men. His expression never hardened. His voice never rose. Yet the warmth seemed to leave the room the instant he spoke. Gentlemen, he said evenly, there is still time to leave this restaurant remembered for your manners instead of your cruelty. I suggest you choose carefully. For several long seconds, nobody answered. The dining room became so quiet that I could hear the faint ticking of the antique clock hanging above the wine shelves. Even the kitchen seemed to pause. The man in the navy blazer forced a smile that looked uncomfortable now. I think this is being blown out of proportion, he said with a nervous laugh. We were only joking. Adrian did not respond immediately. He simply looked at him with the same calm expression that had never changed all evening. It was not anger that filled the silence. It was certainty. A joke, Adrian finally said, is only funny when everyone is laughing. His voice remained even, almost gentle. She was not. Nobody moved. The man glanced toward his friends as though expecting someone to rescue him. None of them spoke. They suddenly found the polished hardwood floor remarkably interesting. Adrian continued, I have spent my entire career meeting people with impressive resumes, expensive suits, and remarkable confidence. Do you know what I remember about almost all of them? The man swallowed without answering. Adrian gave a small shake of his head. Nothing. Because achievements fade. Wealth changes hands. Titles disappear. Character is what remains after everything else is gone. His words settled over the room more heavily than any raised voice ever could. Ethan's parents watched quietly from across the dining room, the little boy still sitting safely between them with a half-finished slice of cheesecake in front of him. Maria stood behind the espresso machine with both hands clasped together, afraid to interrupt the moment. Marco remained near the hostess stand, looking more relieved with every passing second. Adrian turned slightly toward me before speaking again. Less than 1 hour ago, this woman stepped forward while everyone else froze. His gaze returned to the men. She asked for nothing. She expected no applause. She simply helped because another human being needed her. The silence deepened. You saw someone to mock. I saw someone with courage. The words landed softly, yet they carried through every corner of Bellissimo. Nobody looked away now. The man in the navy blazer slowly exhaled before lowering his eyes. His confidence seemed to disappear one careful breath at a time. You are right, he admitted quietly. I should not have spoken to her that way. Adrian did not celebrate the apology. He simply nodded once. Then tell the person who deserves to hear it. The man turned toward me. His face had lost every trace of amusement. Miss Carter, he said, I am sincerely sorry. What I said was disrespectful. You deserved better from me. I studied him for a moment. I could have listed every cruel comment he had made that evening. I could have reminded him how small those words had made me feel. Instead, I remembered Ethan's frightened eyes and the relief that had followed. Life already carried enough weight without adding more bitterness to it. I offered him a small, honest smile. "Thank you for saying that. I accept your apology." Relief washed across his face. His friends quietly echoed their own apologies before stepping back toward the entrance. Nobody applauded this time. Somehow that made the moment feel more genuine. As the restaurant doors closed behind them, conversation slowly returned. Glasses clinked again. Soft jazz floated through the air once more. The room felt lighter than it had all evening. Adrian looked at me one last time before reaching for his untouched espresso. "Kindness should never require courage," he said quietly, almost to himself. "But when it does, very few people choose it." I realized then that he had not defended me because I needed someone powerful to speak for me. He had spoken because he believed dignity should never depend on appearance, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt seen exactly as I was. The last guests drifted back into their conversations as though the evening had quietly turned a page. Bellissimo felt different now. The music had not changed. The candles still flickered across polished tables. Fresh bread still filled the air with its comforting aroma. Yet something invisible had shifted. People looked at one another a little longer before speaking. Smiles came more easily. I finished clearing the final dessert plates from Ethan's family's table when his mother stopped me one last time. She reached into her purse and handed me a folded piece of paper instead of money. "Read it when you get home," she said softly. "Some things deserve more than a tip." I slipped it carefully into my apron pocket without opening it. "Thank you." Ethan wrapped his small arms around me again before waving as his family walked toward the door. "Good night, Miss Emily." "Good night, Ethan." Watching him leave with an easy smile felt like the best ending I could have imagined for the evening. I turned back toward the private dining section just as Adrian's associates quietly excused themselves. One by one they gathered their jackets, exchanged respectful nods with him, and stepped outside, leaving him alone near the window with a cup of espresso that had long since gone cold. I hesitated for a moment before walking over with the coffee pot. "Would you like a fresh cup?" I asked. Adrian glanced at the untouched espresso and smiled faintly. "I believe this one has been waiting long enough." I replaced it with a fresh cup, the rich aroma rising between us. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. The silence felt surprisingly comfortable. "Thank you," he said. "For the coffee?" I asked with a small smile. He looked directly at me. "For reminding everyone in this room what courage actually looks like." I lowered my eyes instinctively. Compliments had always made me uncomfortable, especially sincere ones. "I was only trying to help a little boy." "Exactly." His answer came without hesitation. The people with the strongest character rarely believe they have done anything extraordinary. I let out a quiet breath. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you step in?" The question had been circling my thoughts ever since he stood beside me. He rested one hand lightly against the warm coffee cup before answering. "Because I have spent enough years watching people mistake appearance for value." His voice remained calm, almost reflective. "That mistake costs more than most people realize." He looked toward the front door where the city lights shimmered beyond the rain-speckled windows. Tonight, everyone noticed something obvious. It required no effort. Then his eyes returned to mine. I noticed the person who stayed kind after being humiliated, who remained gentle under pressure, and who ran toward a frightened child while everyone else stood still. I felt emotion rise unexpectedly in my chest. For years I had become so accustomed to defending myself silently that I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone understand without asking for an explanation. Adrian offered a warm smile that reached his eyes for the first time all evening. "Emily, confidence built on appearance disappears with time. Courage only becomes more valuable." I blinked quickly, hoping he would not notice the tears gathering despite my best effort. They were not tears of sadness. They came from hearing words I had quietly wished someone might say for years. I smiled back, smaller than his but completely genuine. Outside, the rain had stopped. Moonlight reflected across the wet Manhattan sidewalks like scattered silver, and for the first time in a very long time, I walked toward the restaurant entrance believing that perhaps the world held more people capable of seeing hearts than I had ever dared to hope. Closing time arrived quietly. The last candle flickered low as Marco locked the front doors, and turned the sign from open to closed. Chairs rested upside down on empty tables, and the familiar sounds of dishes being washed drifted from the kitchen. Bellissimo had finally become still. I untied my apron slowly, folded it across my arm, and remembered the note Ethan's mother had slipped into my pocket. I unfolded the small piece of paper carefully. Her handwriting was simple and neat. It read, "My son will remember your face for the rest of his life because you chose kindness before fear. Thank you for giving our family another tomorrow." I stood there for a long moment, reading those words again and again until they blurred through grateful tears. No amount of money could have meant more. I slipped the note safely into my wallet beside an old family photograph of my mother and me taken years before her health began to decline. Some treasures fit inside envelopes instead of bank accounts. As I stepped outside, the cool night air wrapped around the quiet Manhattan street. Rain had left the sidewalks shining beneath the streetlights, and passing cars reflected across the wet pavement like ribbons of gold. My old sedan waited where I had parked it that afternoon, looking exactly as tired as I felt. I reached into my purse for my keys when I heard measured footsteps behind me. I turned and found Adrian walking toward the curb alone, his associates nowhere in sight. He stopped several feet away, leaving enough space to make the conversation feel comfortable rather than unexpected. "You are heading home?" he asked. "Yes. My mother will probably still be awake waiting for me." A small smile crossed his face. Parents never really stop waiting for their children. I nodded. "No, they do not." For a moment, we simply listened to the city settling into the night. Somewhere a subway rumbled beneath the streets. A taxi splashed gently through a shallow puddle before disappearing around the corner. Adrian looked toward my aging sedan with quiet understanding rather than curiosity. "Take care of yourself too, Emily," he said. "People who spend their lives carrying others often forget they deserve help as well." I smiled softly. "I am still learning that." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a simple business card before holding it toward me. There was only his name, a phone number, and nothing more. No titles. No unnecessary details. "If you ever find yourself in a situation where kindness alone is not enough," he said calmly, "call me." I accepted the card, unsure whether I would ever use it, but somehow certain the offer was genuine. "Thank you." He inclined his head politely before walking toward a waiting black sedan parked beneath a street lamp. Just before opening the door, he looked back one final time. The confident businessman I had watched all evening was gone for a brief second. In his place stood a man wearing the smallest, most sincere smile I had seen on his face. Then he disappeared into the car, and it quietly pulled away into the Manhattan night. I sat behind the wheel of my old sedan for several minutes before starting the engine. The note rested safely inside my wallet. Adrian's business card lay beside it. One reminded me that kindness could save a life. The other reminded me that the right person could see beyond every label the world insisted on placing upon us. As I drove home beneath the glow of city lights, I realized nothing about me had changed. I was still the same woman with aching feet, unpaid bills, and tomorrow's breakfast shift waiting only a few hours away. But something inside me felt lighter. I no longer measured my worth through careless words spoken by strangers. That night taught me a truth I would carry for the rest of my life. The world will always find something obvious to judge first. Real character begins with the rare person who chooses to look one layer deeper, because the greatest beauty anyone can discover is not found in a reflection. It is revealed in the quiet courage of a heart that refuses to stop choosing kindness.